We will go ahead. All right, awesome. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. And I'm very excited to introduce our speaker this morning, someone whose work I have admired since I was a little baby bat biologist. And that is Dr. Gerald Carter, who studies social behavior in bats, and specifically has specialized on understanding vampire bats. So I know we're going to be hearing a lot about vampire bats today, and I have no qualms with that because they are one of the coolest species out there. No bias whatsoever in this room. So without further ado, and Jerry, I will go ahead and continue letting people into the room if they are coming in. So just feel free to ignore those pop-ups. Otherwise, I will go ahead and let you take it away.
Thanks so much. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Yeah. So go ahead and get started. Let's see here. Okay, I want to start talking about the name of the series, My Field for Dummies. And this comes from these popular books that explain things like financing real estate investments in simple language, so complex ideas in simple language, and the introduction to a subfield of people who study bats. And there's people here from many different backgrounds. And so I'm going to be trying to tell you about social behavior in bats in a way that's simple. And it's difficult to do this. There's close to 1,500 bat species. They're among the most socially diverse mammals. They have different mating systems, different social structures, different ways of reproducing, communicating. There's differences in how they roost together, how they forage together, how they learn from each other, how they cooperate. And I've decided what I want to do is not try to do a sort of comprehensive overview of everything that we know about social behavior in bats, but instead I'd like to focus on this concept of a field and what defines a field. And I really think that fields are not defined by facts. They're defined by the questions that we ask. And one of the first things that I have to tell students in my lab is that I don't actually like to talk about facts. I like to talk about evidence, but I don't really believe in facts. Facts are just things that we read somewhere. They might be interpretations of observations we made. And really, what I'm interested in is questions. And the point of research is not really to develop facts. The point is to develop better questions, meaning more clear questions. And if you look at the history of science, this is essentially what happens is every box that we open unravels a series of smaller boxes that we're constantly understanding more and more about the world, but it always just creates more and more questions. And so, for instance, we might ask a question like, do bats have social relationships? And this question is not going to have an answer that's like yes or no. It's going to lead to another question like, well, what exactly do we mean by a social relationship? What is a social relationship? And how would we measure that across different species? And is it fair to compare a social relationship in a human to a social relationship in a bat? And do social relationships require some kind of special adaptive trait? Or are they just byproducts of, two bats live in the same tree and we see them together a lot, so they have a relationship? And if they do require these special traits, how do those traits vary with the ecology of that species, with the ecological niche occupied by that species? And so these are some of the questions that I'm interested in, some of the questions that we focus on in the field that I'm in. And we're always trying to focus on these questions and try to pursue better and better questions. The other part of the title of the series I want to focus on is dummies, and that's because, in my opinion, we're all dummies when it comes to the social lives of bats. We really don't understand a lot about sociality in bats, but I want to start with something that we are very familiar with, which is the social lives of humans and social integration and human relationships. And this term social integration is a term that tries to encapsulate the quality and the quantity of your social relationships. And if you're a human being, this is the most important thing in your life, whether you realize it or not, right? It is a basic human need. If you isolate people, they don't thrive, they often don't survive. Humans are these inherently social animals. Most evolutionary anthropologists agree that a lone female in a hunter-gatherer society cannot raise a child by herself. It truly takes a village. So humans are actually what we call cooperative breeders. We're a species where we're not able to just reproduce like bacteria. There's cooperation that's inherent to our survival and reproductive success. And so social integration is just fundamental to human well-being. And another way to put this is that poor social integration is associated with pretty much every bad health outcome that you can imagine. All of these things that you see here, depression, anxiety, stress and inflammation, just all everything that leads to death, to premature death, is associated with poor social integration. And there's increasing evidence for causal relationships where things like loneliness, a lack of supportive relationships leading to bad health outcomes. One of the big findings from my field of behavioral ecology over the last couple of decades is that many other social mammals also need social connection, many other group living mammals. And and all these lineages that you see here, relationships, social integration, it's a predictor of health, survival, offspring survival, reproductive success. And the way that we study social integration is through social network analysis, where the nodes are individuals, the links are intended to represent relationships. They can have different strengths, they can have different valence, they can be positive or negative. And we know primarily from studies of primates, non-human primates in the wild, but also humans, that social status or dominance rank is often linked to social integration in interesting ways, where, for instance, if you're a low-ranking individual, you can actually compensate for this by having cooperative alliances, cooperative relationships with other individuals. Individuals try to form relationships sort of up the dominance hierarchy. There's a kind of grooming up the dominance hierarchy that occurs. Um, and we have this picture that's emerging from many long-term field studies of many different species of how it is that social structure affects the success of individuals. But one of the things I want to note here is that if you look across these species shown here, bats are absent from this. We actually lack really long-term studies on the social lives of bats. We have many multiple year studies. We do have some long-term field studies, but we don't have as many as you see here with like primates and even rodents and cetaceans. And this is largely because bats are just difficult to watch, and there's not a lot of bat watchers. There's a lot of bird watchers. There's a lot of people who'd be willing to go to Africa and spend all day watching baboons interact, but there's not as many people that watch bats. Um, we know a lot about this causal path, but we know much less about this other reciprocal causal path. So what is it that individuals do that shapes the social networks that they live in? So in other words, how do individuals build and regulate their social relationships that are so important for their success? How do they do this? How do animals social network? And do they do this? Are they just passive victims of their social environment? This brings us back to this question of what is a social relationship? And to put it simply, a social relationship is just the outcome of the history of repeating interactions between two individuals. But to understand what this really means from an evolutionary perspective, it's useful to think about how relationships emerge from individuals and their traits. So individual bats can have social traits, and what we mean by that is there's traits that cause behaviors that impact other bats, other individuals of your species. So for instance, aggression is a social trait. And these social behaviors, they can either help or harm other bats in your social environment. And some of these traits are extremely important, like maternal care. So all bats are affected by maternal care. This is the first thing that you experience as a bat is how good is your mother? It's a very relevant social trait for bats. And bats almost always vary in their proclivity to perform these social behaviors, even things like maternal care. Because in biology, complex traits, they're variable because they're affected by many genes and many environmental factors, and they're affected by random differences in how brains are wired up in utero. And there's variation in maternal care, just like everything else. There's variation in how much bats like to call to other bats, how much they like to cluster with other bats, how aggressive they are, how cooperative they are. And this variation of behavioral traits is partially heritable, which means that it can evolve in populations over time. So a simple way to think about this is that bats that are not good mothers are not going to pass on their genes as often as bats that are excellent mothers, and that's why bats tend to be excellent mothers. So another example of a social trait, and this is work that comes from Gloriana Chavarri and her collaborators, is variation in contact calling of these disc-winged bats. So many of you bat people at least will be familiar with these disc-winged bats, which roost inside furrowed leaves. They have this contact calling system where one bat enters a leaf and calls to other bats to join it in that leaf. And then they stick to the sides of the leaf with these little suction cups. but to coordinate these group movements from leaf to leaf, which they have to do they basically have to do this every day. They rely on this contact calling system, but there's a lot of variation in calling rates where some bats are more vocal than other bats, and this has consequences for the whole group. And this is true of a whole bunch of different social behaviors. So there's variation in calling and fighting, and how much bats like to cluster or forage together, or how much they might learn from each other. Or there's behavior sometimes like grooming, and even helping behaviors like food sharing. And so natural selection is going to favor social traits that propagate one's genetic lineage. That means that these traits are not just good for other individuals, but they're good for you and they're good for your genetic relatives. And social traits therefore tend to have this appearance of being strategic. But it's important to remember that when we talk about strategic social behavior, we're not saying that the bats are understanding what they're doing, just that the traits have this kind of design built into them through natural selection. So we can often ask, well, why did this trait evolve? What is its function? What we mean by that is, why does natural selection favor this trait over a less social trait or a different trait? And if part of a trait's function is to help others, we call it a cooperative trait. But cooperation doesn't always require cooperative traits, right? So it can emerge simply as a byproduct of selfish or even antisocial behavior. So two bats that are psychopaths can still cluster for warmth. They can still have a mutually beneficial relationship. But we expect social traits to be selected when bats can choose their partners, right? So when bats can decide to cluster with a more tolerant bat than with an aggressive bat, that creates a sort of social selection for bats to now want to have these social traits so that they can benefit from having mutually beneficial relationships. And so this leads to another question that's still an open question, which is, how often does this happen? How often do bats actually choose their social partners? And we don't really know the answer to that question, but I'll go into some examples of cases where we have some very good evidence for this. So when you have pairs of bats, they can have these relationships, which they can be cooperative relationships. And relationships are based on the idea that bats recognize each other and have preferences for each other, and that they prefer to associate with each other more than expected by chance. But the nature of a relationship is that it's actually more than the sum of those individuals' phenotypes. So if two bats are highly aggressive, this doesn't mean that if you put them together, they will automatically have a high conflict aggressive relationship. And if two bats are very cooperative, this doesn't mean that if you put them together, they'll automatically cooperate, because relationships are shaped by social history, and there's a complexity, and there's an emergent complexity. And that's one of the things that we try to understand is, what is it that shapes the fate of these different relationships? And that requires trying to understand how relationships form. And so we have examples. One of the really, I wouldn't say early examples, but one of the first really good examples of this is experiments with Pipistrellus coolii, where juveniles were reared together in captivity, and then they were sort of released into a much larger cage. They were reared in small little groups, and these relationships that they developed when they're young, they persisted. They persisted when they were not caged together, and we can ask this question of, are these relationships formed passively, or do the bats actually select specific kinds of partners? And if they do select them, what do they look for? And do they actually try to foster these relationships? And do they try to foster them in strategic ways? Like, do they try to balance quality and quantity of partners? So when you have all these relationships, you put them together, you have a social network, which is a model of social structure. And networks are useful in a couple of different ways. One is that they capture variation among relationships. So when we talk about bats, when we say bats live in a bat colony, we can ask, what is a colony? If there's 1,000 bats inside of a cave, does that mean that all 1,000 bats know each other or recognize each other? No, probably not. So mapping the social networks is a way for us to try to understand the relationships that are inside of what we might call a group. Because bats don't live in stable groups for their whole life. Most bats don't. They're not like ants in this way, that they sort of belong to one single group that you can identify by just looking inside of a tree and you say, there's the group. Now, that varies, of course, but in general, there's some fluidity to a lot of social structures in bats. The other reason that networks are useful is because they tell us about indirect connections, which are important for transmission of pathogens that cause disease or for information. So bats actually have something that looks like precursors of culture, where one bat can learn something and pass that on to another bat, and that bat can then pass that information on to another bat. So bat A might transmit a pathogen to bat B, and B might transmit it to C. And so if you want to understand those indirect connections, it's useful to have these social networks model. And bats have very diverse social systems, like I said, diverse mating systems, and taking this network approach is a way to try to describe some of that variation. So just to give you an example of variation in social systems and mating systems just within one family of bats, Aphalostomates, I'll use a couple of examples here. So the greater spear-nosed bat is this fascinating species where you get very stable groups of unrelated females and one male. And these groups last for years, and all of the offspring disperse from this group. So there's no family structure. These are all unrelated females, and they come together, they synchronize their reproduction, and they all converge on the same call type. So pups that are born into this group, they have individually distinct calls that allow their mothers to recognize them. But the adults make calls that are convergent within the group and different between groups. And the groups appear to be in a sort of competition with each other. There seems to be a kind of tribalism. And an example of that is that females will go out of their way to kill pups from other groups. And females from the same group, even though they could be unrelated to a pup, they'll defend that pup. So every once in a while, a pup will fall from the cave ceiling and it will often be attacked by females always from these other groups. And females from the same group will go down and defend that pup against these other females. And females will also act as babysitters for unrelated pups. But one bat will stay behind. You see here, stay behind with this crush of pups, maybe to protect them from other females, but this is not something we completely understand. And this alloparental care that you see here, this is not due to genetic relatedness because these bats are unrelated to each other. And we don't really understand this. It doesn't seem to be about maintaining a certain group size because all these pups are eventually going to leave this group when they reach adulthood. So we don't really understand why there's so much cooperation within these social groups. And maybe it's about trying to maintain an optimal size of this creche. And maybe there's a relationship between the number of pups that are there and the survival of each pup. And maybe that relationship is difficult to detect because it's a nonlinear relationship. We don't know, but this is a fascinating social system. Now, within the same family, there's a closely related bat, Vampirum spectrum, which is a large carnivorous bat, has a totally different social structure. These are small family groups. They're socially monogamous with biparental care. There's a family, there's a single male, single female, and the recent offspring who haven't dispersed yet. And the parents go out, they fetch food items, and they bring them back for the offspring. And there's observations of the father feeding the mother. And just to make this point, this is all variation that exists in one family of bats. Most bats seem to have these what are called fission-fusion dynamics, which means that this is particularly common in group living bats that are forest-dwelling bats. They'll switch roosts, and then their roosting groups, the group of bats that you see on a particular day will break apart and recombine, and there'll be slightly different group composition each time you look. So you have to track these associations over time, and the social structure only emerges once you've collected many observations of these groups. You can't identify the social structure just by looking at any particular moment. And so here you can see the social structure with these Bechstein's bats. They have this kind of larger closed population, but within this population, there's clearly two different communities that are highly connected, and these communities are not they're not structured around relatedness because matriline's here are shown by the colors of these bats. So each of these is a bat, and those are connections to other bats. And you can see that there's a lot of strong associations with non-kin. And so seems pretty typical that you have preferred relationships with both kin and non-kin. And this seems to be a pretty typical social structure for many bats. And then there are these cases where we just really have no idea of what's going on. It could be something quite simple. It could be something really complex. We don't know. There are bats that form these massive colonies with millions of individuals. This is Bracken Cave in Texas. We know that each mother leaves her pup, leaves this cave, comes back and finds her pup using probably sound at first and then smell, even though the pup is moving around and there are many hundreds of pups for every square foot of cave wall. But beyond that, we don't really know what's going on here. Are there multiple little neighborhoods of bats that are familiar with each other, or do the adults know each other? Are there connections where there are bats that prefer to be near each other and that are also associated outside? We really don't know. And some of the early observations of these social structures, people made assumptions that people used to say, well, there's no way the mother could possibly find her pup, so it must be that all the females just go out and then come back and then just give milk to whatever random pup that they see. That was what people originally thought until people did the work of actually tracking down. Gary McCracken famously tracked down mothers and pups and matched them up and found that they somehow find each other. So a lot of times there's this cryptic complexity to something that we think like this must just be very simple. This must just be a passive aggregation of a lot of bats that are all shoved into this cave because this is the place where they live. And so we don't really know for most species. So a lot of diversity in social network structure of bats, a lot that we don't know. And what we're always trying to understand is what are the consequences of these social networks? How do they impact the health of the bats? How do they impact the evolution of the social traits? Might they affect conservation? How do they impact disease ecology? They're really profound ways that our understanding of social behavior has these rippling effects on many other topics in biology and beyond biology. So what I do want to do now is I am going to talk a bunch about vampire bats, but the way that I want to use vampire bats is as a sort of a case study of how all these different levels of social complexity link up to each other, right? So we have these social traits, and these traits can be strategies, and these strategies can be about forming these relationships, the outcomes of these strategies, and these relationships, and we put them together are networks, and these networks can have consequences. And so I've spent the last 15 years of my life trying to understand this one behavior, food sharing in this one species, because I think it provides us with a system, an experimental system for understanding how cooperative relationships are formed and regulated that can help us understand other bats and even other species. And there's many things that we can do with vampire bats that are difficult to do even with, for instance, primates, which have been their social behavior has been studied much longer. But there's advantages to this vampire bat system, as I'll show you. So the basic story here is that vampire bats, they often fail on hunts. Young bats fail almost every 3 nights or so. They can starve to death quickly. If they fail to get a meal for 3 nights in a row, they'll die. Their offspring can die. But they have the social safety net. They can get food donations from members of their colony. But again, this is not anyone in the group. There are particular socially bonded partners, and that's who is feeding you if you are a vampire bat. You get these food donations, and these food donations are regurgitations of ingested blood. Um, and this is something that we can measure by filming bats. So we do experiments where we try to manipulate these relationships, and we can actually measure how much help does one bat give to another. And by doing that over many years, we can collect many observations. Here's an example of food sharing over 4 years, 1,300 observations, and we can map out the food sharing network of how much every bat feeds every other bat. And what's nice about doing this in captivity is that everyone is together and everyone's familiar and everyone has an equal opportunity to interact. So what you're looking at here is really the choices of the bats and not so much who happens to be where at what time. So the red nodes are the females, the blue nodes are the males. You can see this is mostly a female behavior. And the size of the node shows how many recipients a bat fed. And this is going to be important later because you can already see that variation, that some of these females are feeding many individuals and some of them are not. And the width of the arrow shows the donation rate. And the best predictor of how much one bat feeds another, how much A feeds B, is how much B feeds A. And we can do all kinds of experimental manipulations of this to try to tease apart, well, how willing are these bats to help each other? So here we have a bat feeding another bat that's trapped in a small cage. And so we can really show that the bats are really going out of their way to help. This is not something that's based on harassment or aggression. And even non-relatives will feed each other in this way. And we can study how relationships form because we can put bats together. We can study relationships within groups. We can create in-groups and out-groups and look at how relationships form from the very beginning. And this is all to try to understand this basic question of why do vampire bats feed non-kin? Because this is an interesting social trait that is not so obvious why natural selection would favor this trait of going out of your way to help other individuals that you're not genetically related to. So let's start with the traits that these bats have. It's very important to understand that relative to other bats, vampire bats have this really prolonged maternal care. So they have a 7 month gestation period, which is very long for a phyllostomid bat of their size. Some other phyllostomid bats have gestation periods of like 3.5 months or 4 months. They nurse their offspring for 10 months. It's a really long time. they can live to be basically 30 years old. We have records of them living to be 18 years old in the wild. So for a non-hibernating bat, that's a really long life. Um, and this food sharing is a maternal behavior. It's obviously co-opted from the fact that mother bats feed their offspring with regurgitated blood. They all do this. This is very common behavior. Many other bats do this. Like I was telling you about the vampire spectrum, but there are many cases where outside of milk, mothers bring food items or regurgitate food to feed offspring. And so what we're actually talking about here when we talk about food sharing in vampire bats is a behavior that is a maternal behavior that was extended beyond offspring to other relatives and beyond those relatives to non-relatives to non-kin. And social behavior is another example of this, right? So mothers groom their offspring, and social grooming is also very common in vampire bats. This is a bat grooming itself, and a bat that grooms itself is several times more likely to be groomed by another bat. They groom each other on the parts of the body that the bat can't reach, like the back of the head. There's certain part we've mapped out on the body. What parts of the bat's body is it able to groom with its mouth, or does it have to use its foot, which is not quite as nice. And the places where they get groomed by other bats are the places that they can't reach with their own mouth. They also try to, if we mess up their fur, they'll receive more social grooming. If when we put things like bands on their wings, the other bats try to remove those bands. So I think this is really a helping behavior. And it's something that we can compare across different species of bats. So from the species that we've looked at, this is really something that is specialized in vampire bats. They do about an order of magnitude more social grooming compared to some other bats under identical conditions. And females spend about 5% of their time social grooming other bats, regardless of how many ectoparasites they have, regardless of whether they're in the captivity or in the wild. This is a very stable amount of their time budget. And this number is lower because it includes males, which don't do as much social grooming. There's variation in how much bats groom each other. There's variation in how much bats tend to feed other individuals. This is in one colony, how many non-kin were fed over a period of multiple years. And you can see that some of these bats are feeding many non-kin and others are not feeding non-kin at all. Like this one bat over here at the left side isn't feeding non-relatives. And this is essentially a variation in cooperativeness. So some of these bats just have a proclivity to be helping other individuals more and others less. And we're trying to understand, well, why is that? And one thing that we do understand is that variation in things like social bonding and even things like maternal care or pair bonding, whether or not animals form monogamous relationships, the neuroendocrine mechanisms for this are really conserved across mammals, meaning that some of the same mechanisms that we find in humans and in rodents, and there's a series of really excellent studies with rodents looking at oxytocin and vasopressin receptors in key brain regions like the nucleus accumbens. And this can explain a lot of the variation in things like maternal care and pair bonding, whether or not the animals form monogamous relationships. These receptors can be turned on and off. They can be genetically modified to sort of see the effects on mothers no longer taking care of their offspring when they're not, when they don't have these receptors. And what you see here in the brain of this vole is the density of these receptors in a species that's monogamous versus not monogamous. So we can look at vampire bats and say, do we see that these receptors predict this non-kin social bonding? So not with their offspring, but with unfamiliar, unrelated individuals that they meet. And the answer is yeah. This social bonding that originally evolved from maternal care as extended for other members of your natural line is also extending to unrelated members of your social group. The other thing we can ask is, okay, so they have these variation, we have these traits. Are these strategic? And to make a long story short, what I'll say is that pretty much everything that I've learned about vampire bat social behavior in the last 10 years suggests to me that helping is an adaptive cooperative investment. It's not just a byproduct. It's not just, I don't know who my relatives are and I'm just leaking out help to everyone in my group. They make careful decisions about who they help. And a vampire bat sharing network is not a random network, right? So if you look at a social network from a bat standpoint, it looks something like this. They're highly kin biased, but they also help non-kin. So a bat will give maternal care to her son or daughter. Sons leave when they get to reproductive age, but they can have a lifelong relationship with their daughters that stay in the group. At some point, their daughters start feeding their mothers. So I've seen this as young as 4 months. So they have a bat that is getting milk from its mother, but when its mother is fasted and doesn't have food, its young daughter will regurgitate blood back to her mother. And so you get these reciprocal relationships that form between mothers and daughters and extended to grandmothers and daughters and so on. And siblings, so the vampire bats tend to have half siblings. They will also share food with each other, often in a reciprocal fashion. And then you have these reciprocal relationships that exist between non-kin, where unrelated bats will form relationships with each other. Um, so helping relatives makes sense because you're promoting the replication of the genes underlying that behavior. That's well understood. But if you already have a network of relatives that can feed you, and the point of these relationships is to ensure that, I help you and you help me, why do bats even bother to form these non-kin bonds? Are these just mistakes, or is there something strategic about how they do this? Another way to think about this question is, what is better? Is it better to have quantity of relationships, in which case you have to have non-kin bonds because your matriline is limited? Or is it better to have fewer, stronger relationships? Because this is what we actually see in the vampire bats, that there's a spectrum in terms of how the bats build relationships or have relationships. And one possibility is that the optimal investment in quantity or quality depends on the social environment. And this is a hypothesis that I call social bed hedging. And it's basically the idea that bats diversify their cooperative investments across multiple partners because their social world is very unpredictable. And each partner's availability is uncertain because they move around between these trees, and a bat's mother might not always be there on the night that it needs food. Or a bat's mother might have also failed to get food on the night that she failed to get food. And the evidence for this comes from experiments. I won't go through them in detail, but we've done experiments where we temporarily remove a bat's primary food sharing partner and ask the question, how well do they cope with that? If your mother's not there for you on the night that you need to be fed, does another bat feed you or not? And the answer is that bats that help more non-kin cope better with partner removal. So as the saying goes, you don't put all your eggs in one basket. Bats that only have one relationship with their mother, if we take mom away, that bat doesn't have other relationships where it will be fed by other bats. But bats that do have these relationships beyond their family, beyond their matriline, we take mom away for that night. That bat is fed by these other unrelated individuals that it has invested in the past. And so I think this is the reason why these bats have these extended networks, is their families are too small and they actually require an even broader kind of social integration than they can get from just having a mother and a grandmother or a mother and a daughter. And we've simulated the evolution of this. So we can make agent-based simulations that are hyper-realistic, where we take everything that we know about vampire bats, how they live, how long do they live, how does their weight change over time, how often do they successfully forage, what is the size of their groups, how do they spend their time, how much do they move around. We build all of this into these agent-based simulations, and we can create bats that have different kinds of social strategy. We have bats that invest in more relationships. We have bats that invest in fewer relationships, and then we can run this over evolutionary time. And basically what we find is that when we turn up social instability, if we make bats move around more, they need to have these more diversified relationships to survive. And when we turn the knob down and we force vampire bats to live in really stable societies, even more stable than the societies that we observe in nature, suddenly this diversification isn't necessary and they can have smaller food sharing networks. So we think that bats are forming these new relationships outside of their matriline as other family because their matrilines are simply too small to support them. But how do they do this? How do bats form new relationships? Is it as easy as just going up to another bat and gonna barf blood into your mouth? How does this happen? And a series of studies that we've done has suggested that what they do is they gradually escalate relationships. And this is called raising the stakes or testing the waters. And it's a strategy for developing new cooperative relationships in a way that is reducing the risk of forming a bad relationship. And so what you're essentially doing is you approach first and you see how that goes. You cluster for warmth. Clustering for warmth is not a very costly relationship for you. You're not spending a lot of time and energy doing that. And it's a pretty safe thing to do with another individual. Then you might try grooming. Now, grooming is a little riskier, and it's risky to receive grooming. I mean, these bats, they have razor sharp teeth, and they're grooming each other with their mouth. They're often putting their razor sharp teeth right near another bat's neck or hair. So it's something that requires a certain amount of trust, and it can be reciprocated. And grooming relationships in vampire bats are highly reciprocal. They often start grooming each other at the same time. So you can get a sense of what is this social partner like from grooming. And then once they build up this reciprocal grooming relationship, which can be reciprocated immediately, then they might form a reciprocal food sharing relationship where you actually regurgitate a portion of your blood meal to give to another individual. So you put all these relationships together and we have networks. And one of the things that's important to understand about social networks is that you need a lot of data to map out the social structure of bats. And we used to do this by just studying bats for years because that's how long you have to watch bats to map out these relationships. But now, because of various technology, biologgers, RFID, radio frequency identification, GPS, you can put loggers on bats and you can sample all the bats simultaneously, right? So this is something to be really difficult to do. Oops, sorry, I don't know what's going on there with that video. This is something that would be really difficult to do with manual observations. Because if, let's say you have 100 bats, that's 4,950 pairs of bats, and that's 9,900 directed relationships that you would need to estimate. And so this is why these automated techniques are really useful because we can get these dynamic social networks. And one of the things we've realized is that there's a lot more social complexity than we might think from just what we can easily observe. Because often what we do is we look at bats switching between roosts, but a lot of social dynamics are actually happening inside these roosts. So bats might be moving between trees, and then within each tree, you get these little clusters that form, and the bats are only able to directly interact with the bats within their same cluster. They're not cut off from the bats that are in other trees, and they're only able to interact with those bats in their same tree. And then they're only really interacting with those bats, but they're interacting in biased ways. So one bat might be clustered with two bats, but it might spend 9% of its time grooming one and then only 10% of that grooming time with another. And so what you have are these nested scales of interaction that are all shaped by movement, right? So each spatial scale constrains who can interact with who at the next scale down. And all else being equal, bats that are moving around more at each scale are going to be more socially connected. And this is an important thing to think about when we're thinking about transmission of things like pathogens, for instance, that a lot of this is driven by the individual trait of just being a bat that moves around a lot or not. All these relationships that we measured in the lab are, tend to be correlated with each other. So bats that are clustering together tend to be the ones that are grooming, that tend to be the ones that are sharing food. And we've seen that the same relationships in the lab exist in the wild. So we've actually released a colony of captive colony of bats to the wild, continued tracking them with these proximity sensors, and we can see that the food sharing relationships extend to these completely normal environments. And not only do the relationships within the roost extend from captivity to the wild, but also in the wild, the same bats that are encountering each other inside the tree, they are encountering each other when they're out there foraging. And what's interesting about this is not because the bats forage together. It seems that many bats do not actually socially forage in the sense of they leave as a group together. So we have not seen this with vampire bats. They don't ever leave together. They always leave individually, but then they meet up with each other out there on the cattle pasture or wherever it is that they're foraging. We've seen this with many other bats as well, that bats are constantly making calls and they make social calls. And so there's a lot of coordination of activities of what the bats are doing out there when they're foraging. So with vampire bats, this is essentially finding an animal like a cow, which is to a vampire bat, a cow is a food patch, but you still have to open a wound. And there's a lot of cooperation and conflict during foraging because two bats can fight over a wound, they can feed peacefully from the same wound, and there might be these what we call producer-scrounger dynamics, where one bat opens a wound and then another bat might be able to exploit that or share it, depending on the relationship between the bats. But this is all stuff that we don't really understand. There's all kinds of cryptic social behaviors that bats are performing when they're out there flying around that we're only now uncovering. So, fairly recently, or at least during the time that I've been in science, we found that Aaron Corcoran found that bats are jamming each other's echolocation calls. They're jamming each other's sonar to try to steal prey items from each other. And bats also make social calls to try to ward off other bats, to compete with other bats over food. And there might also be calls that bats make to do the opposite. Maybe bats make calls to call in other bats to get the benefits of social foraging. So here are some of the calls that were made just in that video clip that I showed you. And some of these calls we understand. We know contact calls are used. Bats actually can call in their food donors with these contact calls. They recognize each other from these calls. We have these calls that we're calling N-shaped calls, which we're just now starting to link to foraging because we find that they make them around feeders in captivity, and they also make them, and we've seen them make them in cases where they're foraging in the wild. But this is also, I feel, a kind of endless well of possibilities. There's so many kinds of vocalizations that bats make. There are bats that sing. There's learning of song, and we just really are scratching the surface when it comes to vocal communication in bats. There's many different calls that bats make, and they make these beautiful spectrograms, but we don't understand a lot of what is going on with social calls. So another kind of social structure that's very common in maybe all group living animals have these. I mean, this is dominance hierarchies, which is this idea of if we come across a resource, who's going to have preferential access to that resource? It's going to be maybe the bigger individual. This is often considered like resource defending or resource holding potential. And we have looked at this in vampire bats. And what's interesting is that female vampire bats, first of all, they're larger than males, which is not uncommon in bats, and they're socially dominant. They seem to be socially dominant over males. And they have what you might call egalitarian relationships. They don't have very clear linear dominance hierarchies. If you look at female mammals, these are all different species of mammals where female dominance hierarchies have been measured. And one way to measure dominance hierarchy is directional consistency, which is what's the probability that the same individual wins a dispute, say over food or over a particular place where they both want to be. And vampire bats had the lowest directional consistency of all of these species. Another way to look at this dominance hierarchy is to say, what's the probability that the higher ranking individual, in this case, we're only looking at females, wins in a dispute? So I should say, first of all, that male vampire bats do have a very obvious dominance hierarchy because they fight over territories. They defend these territories from each other. They don't defend groups of females like the greater spear-nosed bats. They defend a territory that, and they cannot control the movement of the females. Females are coming in and out of these territories, but the males will fight over these territories. And so what we're looking at here is what's less obvious to us is there a dominance hierarchy in the females? And in many group living primates, there are these very clear dominance hierarchies. So the line very quickly goes to one. There's basically a 100% probability the higher ranking female is going to get what she wants. And you see that across multiple species. I'm just showing you here two different primates. And vampire bats, it's just less clear. So there is a dominant structure, but it's much less obvious. And this is not because of sample size. This is because of just the unpredictability of who's going to get a food item. But we see this social structure replicated across groups. So it does seem to be something that this is not just something that's describing one particular colony, one particular time. But what we've also seen is that dominant structure changes with things like food availability. So one of the real basic questions in my field is trying to understand when we look at social structure, it's often based on one group of bats in one location, one time. And what we want to understand is how well does social structure replicate across different groups, across populations. Okay, so I want to finally talk about consequences of these social networks and variation in these social networks. And there's so many different things I could talk about here, but I thought I would just focus on one thing, which is this really interesting example of what you can think of as social evolution feedbacks, right? So this is something that's of general importance in the evolution of societies and the evolution of social traits, but that I think we can illustrate here well with vampire bats. And that is the idea which I've shown you, that there's variation in these social traits like food sharing, variation in how much bats share food, and probably variation in how much they reciprocate. And this is because of genetic mutations, but also migration, and also because of flexibility where individuals can just choose to act differently it's basically learning based on their experiences. And one thing we think is happening, but we haven't completely measured this yet, is we think that bats are choosing in partners carefully or conditionally, or that we know that they do this with relatives, but basically they're not indiscriminately helping. They're helping particular individuals. And we think that they use their past social interactions in order to make these choices. And we're still trying to measure this effect, but we think this is going on. And one of the results of this is you're going to have increased partner helping. So if there's bats that are trying to associate with more helpful bats, then that incentivizes in the population bats to be more helpful because they will be more likely to have these cooperative relationships that are beneficial for them. And what actually ends up happening is that it should be that when you look at a population of bats, you find that almost all the bats are sharing food or almost all the bats are cooperative because if they're not so cooperative, then they suffer the consequences of not being as socially integrated. But what's interesting is that when you have bats being highly cooperative and there's less variation in that trait, it reduces selection for the enforcement. It reduces selection of why are you choosing or why are you rewarding or punishing or being so discriminating if everyone in the population is really helpful? It's actually you're paying a cost to do something you don't need to do. And so there's a lot of theory that suggests that a lot of enforcement actually makes itself unnecessary, right? So if you've got policing and the policing is 100% effective, what's the point of having the police? If you have a military and your military is 100% effective, then there's no war, then we don't need a military. So essentially you have enforcement of cooperation where the house, if the enforcement is successful, it makes itself less necessary. And that can actually select for bats to be less careful and less conditional. And the cycle repeats itself because that situation of bats being less discriminating and more forgiving and more and less suspicious or more trusting creates opportunities for there to be more free riding or for there to be more variation in these cooperative traits. And I think vampire bats give us an example where we might be able to test some of these ideas because we can measure things really well and sort of fill in parameters for some of these models. The last thing I'll say is that everything I've talked about, is talking about social evolution and social behavior. And bats are, I think, not just good models for studying social evolution, they're also an emerging model for social neuroscience, which is something you shouldn't ask me about because I don't really know much about neuroscience, but a team of neuroscientists, including Knock, Molinovsky, Michael Yartseb at UC Berkeley, Yossi Ova, Tel Aviv University, we've sort of developed Egyptian fruit bats as this really amazing system for studying how brains work in general. And not vampire bats and Egyptian fruit bats are an example of another a model system that's being developed. So I'll just end with these last questions, just endless questions. Some of the questions that we really would like to see answered, but we don't know the answers to, is to what extent does social integration impact individual health across different bat species? I've focused a lot on vampire bats, but how much do these things generalize to other bat species? And how is bat social behavior and social structure shaped by the ecology of the species? And how does social structure shape the traits of those bats? How does it shape things like their cognition? These are all some of the questions that I'm very interested in, and many people in my field are very interested in. And so with that, I will take any questions with time that we have.
All right. Thank you so much, Jerry. That was an incredible talk. An incredible talk full of like so much cool information. And obviously I could talk to you forever about all of this. So I will keep myself quiet and open the floor up to anyone that has questions. You can feel free to put them in the chat or to ask Jerry. Oh, we've got some thank yous in the chat. And thank you all for coming today as well. All right. Well, man, you must have done a really good job at describing social structures. See that
I built up this topic of better questions, and we need really good questions. Now everybody feels too much pressure. Nobody wants to ask it.
maybe that's it. That you put too much emphasis on asking questions and now everyone's scared. Can you talk a little bit about how you got started, i.e., your first question?
Yeah, so well, I've been a bat nut since I was a little kid. Um, I saw a bat when I was 2 years old, maybe three, in the Philippines. So my mom is from the Philippines. My mom actually is part of a, sorry, this is long. I'll try to make the story short. My mom was from a tribe, actually like a tribe that's known for being a headhunting tribe, the Kalinga people in the mountains of Luzon in the Philippines. And she used to actually hunt flying foxes when she was a little girl. And so they eat bats there. And I was born in the United States, but my mom took me back to the Philippines where she was from. And the last time this happened was when I was 2 or 3, which is why I know when it occurred. But what this is my earliest memory is seeing a flying fox. And then much later, I guess probably in first grade or something, I remember being in school and flipping through an animal encyclopedia and seeing a image of a flying fox and having this funny thing because it's like I'm probably 6 years old or 5 years old and I'm remembering something from when I'm 2. So it felt like a distant memory from way back in my childhood, quote unquote, my childhood. But I remember that moment and I remember being obsessed with bats since that moment. So I've always been interested in bats. And then in high school, I also became really interested in, I guess I just became interested in societies and cooperation and why is it that some what explains the variation in different human society? What explains things like where the Amish come together and build houses for each other? And I'm sort of interested in all these things in high school, and then it just became this like perfect amalgamation of these two different things I was interested in to study the evolution of cooperation in bats. And I got started with vampire bats actually because of Bats magazine that Bat Conservation International puts out. There's an article called, you can look this up, there's an article called The Lure of the Vampires about a researcher at Cornell University. And so I went to Cornell University because of this article. I read about vampire bats and I met the graduate student. That article, Claudia Cohen, was the graduate student that was her research is being described in Bats magazine. And I met with her and then she got me involved with vampire bats. And then, yeah, and then I, I got involved with undergraduate research very early at Cornell, and then that just completely changed the whole course of my life from that point forward.
Oh, well, so there was a follow-up, which was you didn't answer the question, which was, what was your
What
first
was my first
question?
question? My first question was, what do vampire bats feed on in the wild when they're not feeding on livestock? And other people have since answered this question, but I like developed this technique of sequencing DNA from feces, which is now like everybody does this. But back in whenever this was like 2001, this hasn't really been done that much. And so that was, I worked on a project trying to understand like diets of vampire bats. And then I worked on a project looking at walking and running in vampire bats. So maybe many of you have seen this footage of a vampire bat running on the treadmill. This Dan Riskin's
Yep.
PhD, and I was undergrad assistant on that project. And then when we were running the vampire bats on these treadmills and on these force platforms, white-winged vampire bats, the way we would get them to walk across the force plate is we would put one on the other side and it would call, and the other one would go over to it. And I became really interested in those calls and communication. And then when I was studying communication for my master's, I saw them sharing food. And I had read about food sharing in vampire bats because it's this like textbook example of cooperation. And then I just became obsessed with this idea of like, it's, what's, I just wanted to revisit that story and try to understand more about it because it had become controversial by the time that I started graduate school. It was published in 1984 in Nature. It was in all these textbooks. And then because nobody had gone back and collected more data and people had made all these mathematical models saying, oh, this isn't actually complicated. This is really simple. Like the bats are just helping anyone in their group and the whole thing is stable for simple rules. And I wanted to go back and collect more data on it. So sorry, that was a very long-winded answer, but that's how I got started.
We did get another question, and I'm also interested in this. So I do want to get to it before we run out of time. How would you think of approaching this study in things like meiotis bats? Interesting questions are arising from the probiotic study and the way that probiotic is shared across colonies. So, and they're so hard to watch. They're more difficult to track, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's so many technologies that are just changing the kinds of data we can collect. And so I think a lot of it is just figuring out where can you get the most purchase? Like what kinds of data can we collect now that we couldn't collect before? Now we can, I mean, Dana and I were talking about epigenetic aging of bats, where now we can tell the age of a bat. We can look at whether the bats are aging faster or slower. You can get, now there's metagenomic sequencing. You can look at microbiomes of bats very easily. You can look at, and so there's just these biologgers have changed things a lot because now we can collect a lot of social data very quickly. And so I think it's this kind of combination of just looking at what are the methods, what are the state of the art methods at the moment, and how do those match up with the most interesting questions that we have. And I think there's just endless questions. I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but I guess that's my attempt
Well,
to answer that
I think
contemplated question.
the wonderful thing about being in the sciences is that it's the field for curious people because once you answer one question, a million more pop up per usual. And I always wonder about, in fact, my first project for my PhD was going to be looking at social interactions and roost switching and fission fusion dynamics of silver-haired bats. And then I went half blind. And if there's something you don't want to do is climb up very tall trees when you are freshly lacking depth perception. So, all right. Well, we are just about. Do we have any more questions? This was such a fantastic talk. It really does dive into so many different aspects of bat ecology, and bat research. And so, thank you so much, Jerry. That was such a fantastic talk. And this is going to get posted. If you want to go back and look at some of the references or if there's information that you want to revisit, we are posting this talk up on our YouTube channel probably by the end of the day today. And it will also be available on the GBATnet website. So if there's things you want to revisit, please feel free to go onto the YouTube or onto the website and you can have access to this talk again. All right.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us today. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the day. All right.
I'll do the typical Zoom wave now.
Yeah.
So,
Bye, everyone.
I, oh, that was a good time for my camera lens to just flap down. Always
Thanks,
good that that
Jerry.
happens at the end and not in the middle.
Okay. Yeah, so and I will wait for your email with the PDF. Whenever,
Ah,
again, no
yes.
rush,
Yeah.
whenever you're ready.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I'll do that.
All right.
Okay. Great. That
Have a
that
good one.
didn't
Thank
go
you again
over.
so
I was
much.
surprised. Like,
No, it was
okay. Yeah.
perfect. It was perfect.
Yeah. It was like 90 slides. I'm like, ooh. Okay.
All right. I'll see you later.
Okay. Talk to you later.